The column had been moving for 3 hours when the shooting started. Not from the front, not from the rear. From everywhere at once, it is November 17, 1965. The central highlands of South Vietnam, 2 kilometers northeast of a dried-out creek bed the maps call the Ia Drang River. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade's battalion, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, 1st Cavalry Division, is strung out across nearly 500 meters of elephant grass and scrub forest, moving in a loose column toward a landing zone the Americans have designated Albany. The point element has just made contact with 2 PAVN soldiers. McDade has called his company commanders forward for a meeting. That means the battalion's command group and the men clustered around it are now standing still in the open while the rest of the column waits behind them, spread thin in the grass. The 8th Battalion of the People's Army's 66th Regiment has been watching them for 20 minutes. Then the world comes apart. To understand how 400 American soldiers ended up in that grass, you have to go back 3 days and 20 kilometers to the southwest, to a different landing zone, a different battalion commander, and a battle that went the other way. The Ia Drang Valley in November 1965 was not a place anyone had fought before. It was triple canopy jungle and chest-high elephant grass in the central highlands of Pleiku Province, close to the Cambodian border, crossed by almost no roads. The PAVN had been using it as a staging ground and infiltration corridor for months. Specifically, the 66th Regiment and the 33rd Regiment of the B3 Front, roughly 2,000 soldiers in total, positioned to sweep east and cut South Vietnam in half at its narrowest point. If they succeeded, they would sever Highway 19, split the country, and demonstrate to Hanoi and Washington alike that American infantry and the new air assault concept the 1st Cavalry Division had been built around could be beaten in the field. On November 14, the 1st Cavalry Division inserted Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, into Landing Zone X-Ray, 5 kilometers to the southwest of Albany, directly into the middle of that PAVN concentration. What followed over the next 34 hours was the largest engagement between American and North Vietnamese forces to that point in the war. 450 Americans against what eventually amounted to 1,800 PAVN soldiers, and Moore's battalion held. The PAVN hit X-ray in human wave assaults beginning within minutes of the first helicopter's landing. Moore used every artillery asset available, called in B-52 arc light strikes on the surrounding jungle, directed his companies by radio while moving between positions under fire, and kept his perimeter intact. When it was over, Moore's battalion had lost 79 men killed. The PAVN had lost, by American count, more than 630. X-ray was a victory, a hard, costly, tactically sophisticated victory, and it confirmed that the air assault concept worked. Helicopters could put infantry directly onto a contested objective faster than any previous doctrine allowed. It also left the PAVN 66th Regiment still in the field, battered but intact, moving northeast through the jungle toward their base camp, right into the path of Robert McDade's battalion. Hal Moore was 43 years old, a West Point graduate, a veteran of Korea, and a man who had spent 2 years preparing his battalion specifically for this kind of fight. He had studied counterinsurgency doctrine, drilled his men on immediate action drills for ambushes, and personally walked every company through the terrain analysis process he intended to use in combat. At X-ray, he had controlled a chaotic, 3-sided battle by staying close enough to the action to understand what was happening and far enough back to direct the whole picture. His after-action instincts were sound, and his communications discipline was tight. Robert McDade was a different kind of officer. 50 years old in November 1965, he had taken command of 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry only weeks before the Ia Drang operation. He was not new to the Army. He had served in World War II in Korea, but he was new to this battalion, new to the 1st Cavalry Division's air assault methods, and new to the specific tactical environment of the Central Highlands. The men of 2-7 Cav did not know him well. He did not know them well either. That gap would matter. Brigadier General Richard Knowles was the 1st Cavalry Division's Assistant Division Commander, forward deployed and flying above the Ia Drang in a command and control helicopter during both the X-ray and Albany engagements. He would be the senior American officer with the clearest aerial view of what happened to McDade's column, and his later accounts of what he observed from above would become part of the documented record of why Albany went the way it did. The third figure in this story has no face the historical record can give us. The commander of the PAVN 8th Battalion, 66th Regiment, the unit that executed the ambush at Albany, is not identified by name in the American after-action reports or in the Vietnamese military histories available in translation. What is documented is the decision his unit made, not to retreat toward Cambodia after the beating at X-ray, but to move northeast, stay close to the American units they knew were following, and wait for the right moment. That decision was tactically sound in a way that would prove catastrophic for 2-7 Cav. On paper, it looked like a movement to contact with a diminished enemy. There was just one problem. The PAVN 66th Regiment was not diminished. and they were not retreating after the fighting at X-Ray ended on November 16th, the 1st Cavalry Division's plan called for 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry to move overland from LZ X-Ray northeast to LZ Albany, a distance of roughly 6 kilometers through jungle and elephant grass, where helicopters would extract them. It was a movement, not an assault. The assumption built into the orders was that the PAVN forces in the area had been broken by 3 days of fighting and American air power and were withdrawing. McDade's battalion would move to Albany, be extracted, and that would be the end of the Ia Drang operation. The intelligence picture available to McDade on the morning of November 17 was incomplete in ways that were not fully apparent until later. The PAVN 66th Regiment's 8th Battalion was moving on a parallel axis northeast, which meant it was not in front of McDade's column or behind it. It was moving alongside it through the jungle to the north at roughly the same pace. The Americans did not know this. Their route of march and the PAVN's route of march were converging on the same piece of ground near Albany, like two lines drawn toward the same point. McDade's column moved out in the morning. The battalion was organized in a standard march column. Alpha Company at the front, then Headquarters Company, then Delta Company, then Bravo Company at the rear, with Charlie Company on the flank. That arrangement stretched the column across roughly 500 meters of terrain, a distance that, in heavy elephant grass, meant the front of the column could not see the rear, and the rear could not hear orders passed from the front without radio relay. The column moved through the grass. It moved slowly, the terrain was difficult, the heat was brutal, and the men were already tired from 3 days of operations. By early afternoon, they were close to Albany at approximately 13-7 hours. The point element of Alpha Company captured 2 PAVN soldiers, stragglers, or so it appeared. McDade moved forward with his command group and called his company commanders to join him at the front to discuss what to do with the prisoners and how to approach the landing zone. What happened next is the fulcrum of the entire battle, with McDade and his company commanders clustered at the front. The rest of the column stopped moving. The men sat down in the grass where they stood, in the open, spread across 500 meters, with no coherent perimeter, in small groups separated from each other by the terrain. Some ate rations, some took off their gear. They had been moving all day. They were tired. The PAVN 8th Battalion had been moving parallel to them and was now in position on the north side of the column's route of march. They had watched the Americans stop. They had watched the command group cluster at the front. They understood what they were looking at. At approximately 13-15 hours, the 8th Battalion attacked from the north, directly into the middle of the strung-out column, at the point of maximum vulnerability, the section where Headquarters Company and the attached units were concentrated. Closest to the command group and farthest from either end of the fighting elements, the attack was not a probing contact. It was a coordinated assault designed to cut the column in half, which it did within the first minutes. The grass that had been concealing the PAVN soldiers all afternoon concealed them until they were close enough to make the initial fire devastating. The Americans in the middle of the column, hit without warning from close range and with no established perimeter, were in serious trouble before anyone at the front or rear of the column had a clear picture of what was happening. McDade was at the front when it started. The radio traffic coming back to him was fragmented and contradictory. Units reporting contact without clear positions, because in the grass no one could see far enough to give a clear position. What he understood was that his battalion had been hit in the middle and that the column was no longer intact. The fight that followed lasted roughly 4 hours and took place across a battlefield that was by any measure chaos. The PAVN soldiers pressed the attack aggressively, moving through the grass and the trees in groups of 5 and 10, hitting isolated clusters of Americans who were trying to consolidate and form perimeters without clear communications to adjacent units. Some platoons fought as coherent units. Others were overrun before they could establish a defense. Overhead, Brigadier General Knowles in his command helicopter could see the shape of the battle in a way no one on the ground could. What he saw was a column that had been cut into pieces, with no coherent perimeter in the middle and heavy fire across most of its length. He began directing artillery from above and coordinating the helicopter gunships that were the Americans' most effective tool for breaking up the PAVN assault. Artillery saved the battalion. That is not an overstatement. The gun batteries supporting 27 Cav, specifically the 1st Battalion, 21st Artillery, fired continuously in support of the embattled column, and the gunship runs by the Hueys of the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion broke up the PAVN's ability to consolidate their gains. By mid-afternoon, reinforcements from the 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry were inserted at Albany, but they arrived into a landing zone that was still under fire, and the consolidation of the perimeter was slow and costly. By nightfall on November 17, the shooting had tapered off. The PAVN 8th Battalion had broken contact and was moving back north through the jungle. What happened in those 4 hours decided everything that came after. The Butcher's Bill at LZ Albany was the worst single engagement in the entire Ia Drang Valley campaign. 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry suffered 155 men killed and 124 wounded out of the roughly 400 who had started the march that morning. By casualty percentage, it was one of the worst single-day losses of the entire Vietnam War. The dead were recovered over the following days, many of them found in the grass where their small groups had been overwhelmed. The PAVN 8th Battalion suffered significant losses as well. American estimates place their killed at approximately 403, though Vietnamese sources have never confirmed a figure that high, and the actual number remains uncertain. What is documented is that the 66th Regiment withdrew from the Ia Drang Valley after Albany and did not launch the eastward push toward Highway 19 they had planned. The Ia Drang campaign, both battles combined, cost the 1st Cavalry Division 234 men killed. The PAVN B3 front lost, by American count, approximately 3,561 killed across the operation, though these figures were disputed then and remain so. The Army declared Ia Drang a strategic victory. The statistics supported the argument. Kill ratios heavily in the Americans' favor, PAVN operational plans disrupted, the 1st Cavalry Division's aerosol concept proven in its first major engagement. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara flew to Vietnam in November 1965 and returned telling President Johnson that the war was going well. Here is what the Army did not emphasize about Albany, and what the victory narrative obscured for years afterward. The ambush at Albany was not unforeseeable. After-action analysis, including accounts from officers present and from General Knowles' observations from above, established that the practice of halting a march column to consolidate the command group at the front, leaving the rest of the column stopped in the open without a perimeter, was a known vulnerability. The PAVN had exploited exactly that vulnerability. The decision to call the company commanders forward, which stripped the column's middle and rear of their leadership at the moment of contact, was McDade's decision, and it was the decision that made the ambush's initial effect as catastrophic as it was. The Army never court-martialed Robert McDade. He was not formally censured. He was reassigned, eventually promoted to full colonel, and retired. In the years after the battle, he gave very few public accounts of what happened at Albany, and the accounts he did give emphasized the PAVN's tactical skill and the terrain's difficulty. Those things were real. But the after-action picture, assembled from multiple survivor accounts, from Knowles' observations, and from the testimony of company commanders, is clear on the decision that opened the door. The men who had been in the grass were less forgiving. Survivor accounts collected over the following decades. By Joe Galloway, the UPI journalist who had been present at X-Ray and who co-authored the definitive account of the Ia Drang campaign with Hal Moore, described a command failure at Albany that the Army's official history softened. The battalion had been walked into the kill zone of a unit that was paralleling their route of march, halted in the open at the worst possible moment, and deprived of its company-level leadership at the moment the attack began. That is what the after-action reports, read carefully, show. Hal Moore spent the rest of his career and much of his retirement writing and speaking about the men who'd served with him in the Ia Drang Valley. His book, co-written with Joe Galloway and published in 1992, was titled We Were Soldiers Once and Young. It covered both X-Ray and Albany, and it did not minimize what had happened to McDade's battalion. Moore and Galloway gave the dead of Albany their names and their stories. The book became the basis of a 2002 film. Moore died in February 2017 at the age of 94. Richard Knowles continued his Army career after Ia Drang, eventually retiring as a Major General. His after-action assessments of the Albany engagement contributed to the 1st Cavalry Division's revised doctrine for movement to contact in jungle terrain, specifically the requirement to maintain tighter unit cohesion and avoid halting a march column in the open without establishing local security. Robert McDade retired from the Army as a colonel. He died in 2009. The after-action record of his decisions at Albany is now part of the documented history of the battle, studied at the Army's Command and General Staff College as an example of what happens when a commander loses situational awareness of his own column's vulnerability in a fluid contact environment. The 155 men who died in the elephant grass at LZ Albany on November 17, 1965 are listed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. Panel 3E through 4E. Many of them have never appeared in a history book by name. They were there because the plan called for them to be there, because the intelligence picture was incomplete, because the man at the front of the column made a decision that left them exposed at the worst possible moment, and because the PAVN 8th Battalion was good enough to exploit it. That is what happened at LZ Albany. If you found this story worth knowing, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you learned something new, and leave a comment telling me which overlooked battle from the Vietnam War you think deserves its own video. This video is based on real historical events and depicts real figures. Some dialogue, interior thought, and reconstructed detail have been artistically rendered for storytelling purposes. The core events, unit designations, casualty figures, dates, and documented decisions reflect the historical record as established in after-action reports, survivor accounts, and published military histories including Moore and Galloway's We Were Soldiers Once and Young.